Hello, this is a short lecture on ecological succession. Succession is the process by which the numbers of organisms and the type of organisms that live in a community change over time. So for instance, if I have a field with some weeds on it, those weeds might turn into shrubs, they'll turn into small trees, and they'll turn into larger trees. That would be an example of succession. In terms of the ecological organization and the different levels, succession is going to occur on the ecosystem level. There are two types of succession, primary and secondary. Primary succession occurs when an area gets plants for the very first time. Secondary succession occurs where an area is getting plants for at least the second time, if not more than that. Both types of succession are similar in the fact that they both begin with what we call pioneer species. A pioneer species is the very first organism to colonize an area. You can relate this to people. Pioneers are people who go and explore a new territory for the very first time. Okay, so some differences. Primary succession occurs where biotic factors were not established. So there were no living organisms in an area before the pioneer species came. That would be primary succession. In primary succession, no soil is present. So in order for plants to really come into the area, we have to make the soil first. This takes a very long time. With secondary succession, this occurs when biotic factors were already established. So soil is present. So secondary succession occurs at a much faster rate. So you might be thinking about examples of primary succession. Where on Earth can we find locations where no plants and animals have ever been before? Example number 1 is glacier retreating. So when a glacier comes down a mountain, it's going to scrape away all living organisms, all plants, and even the soil. When the temperatures increase and the glacier starts to melt, you're left with barren rock. There's no soil, there's no plants, there's no organisms whatsoever. Another example would be volcanic eruptions. When the volcano erupts, it's going to produce lava, and that lava will solidify, turn into solid rock, and there will be no soil and no plants again. And a third example would be landslide. Here you see there are no plants where the newly formed landslide came down. So secondary succession, remember, that's where plants and animals have already been in that location before and have already established that land. So we're going to have a lot more soil present in these locations. So first example are abandoned fields. So a farmer plows his fields. If they stop plowing the fields and they stop planting and using the fields, you're going to find some weeds that grow, and eventually you'll get small shrubs and larger trees. Forest fires will be another example. It's going to wipe out all the living species, but you still have a good, strong soil base there. Natural disasters, hurricanes, tornadoes, and floods. These would be examples of natural disasters that can wipe out living organisms. And our last example was logging, where humans will come in and clear cut away an entire forest, and again leave nothing living behind. Okay, so our pioneer species might look a little bit different from primary succession and secondary succession, because with primary succession you typically don't have soil, whereas secondary succession you often do have soil. So with primary succession, some pioneer species would be like bacteria and lichen. Lichen is a mixture of fungus and algae. This is a mutualistic relationship. The bacteria and the lichens will both emit a little bit of acid, and that acid will slowly break down the rock, and from that you'll eventually get a little bit of soil. Once you have soil, you can get other types of plants like weeds. Examples of secondary succession pioneer species. Again, the soil is already present, so we don't need the lichens and the bacteria to create the acid to break down the rocks to make soil. Since we have soil already present, we can get other types of plants, such as grasses, shrubs, and fireweed. In terms of how long primary and secondary succession take, primary succession is going to take a lot longer to develop then secondary succession because there's no soil present. So the mosses and the lichens and the bacteria, it takes a long time to break down the rock to finally make soil in order to get the other species. With secondary succession, there's already soil there, so we can skip the whole soil making process and automatically start out with the weeds. The process in which primary succession occurs starts out with your pioneer species such as lichen and bacteria. They're going to grow in the rocks, and it's going to break down the rocks a little bit. Along with the pioneer species, the wind and the water hitting the rocks day in and day out is going to weather the rocks, and that process will also form soil. New soil is going to allow grasses to grow. Once the grasses are established, they will slowly die, and this will add nutrients to the soil. The soil will now be a little bit richer, rich enough to support shrubs and other trees. This is a picture of secondary succession because we already have plants and some soil. The first type of pioneer species you might get will be called annual plants, which means they may die at the end of the summer season. Then you can get grasses and perennials. This is 3 to 4 years out. Perennials are plants that will come back year after year after year. After that, you're going to get, in addition to the grasses, you'll get shrubs, pines, young oak, and hickory, so some smaller trees that can grow relatively quickly. This can last up to 150 years. After that, we'll get mature oak and hickory forests, mature meaning they're much older, we're talking 150 years or older, and at this point is considered stable. It's the end of succession.